The year is 1970 and an 81-year-old Austrian painter is contemplating the work of his life, an empire that stretched all the way from Madagascar in Africa to the icy north of Norway, and from Andorra in the west to Moscow in the east. As he looks astonished by the scale of his own achievements, he tries to remember how it all came to be. The idea of an Axis victory during World War II is probably the most popular example of modern alternate history, be it because of the impressive initial German triumphs or the technological superiority of the German army. Many people find it easy to imagine a world where the Third Reich managed to achieve, at least partially, some of its long-term goals. Some even envision Mustache Guy ruling over the entirety of, or most, of the world with an iron fist. Personally, I don't see this ever happening, but what about a more reasonable Axis victory? One that would allow Germany to keep its grasp over continental Europe and the European colonies while accepting the existence of rival powers such as England, Russia, and the US. That's the type of entertaining scenario that I would like to imagine today. Also notice that I'm not gonna talk much about Japan, and this isn't the men in the high castle. I don't see them achieving much after Pearl Harbor. I see this hypothetical as the result of two historical changes that I see as not that disruptive. Well, the second one is kind of debatable, but the first one is cool. Also, this is fiction. Also, this video was made for entertainment and non-political purposes. So let's start with the first one, yeah. Mustache Guy decided that after grabbing Austria and taking small bites at Czechoslovakia, the next logical step was to march straight into Poland. Naturally, England and France were like, hey, not cool, and declared war on Germany. Soon we had ourselves what threatened to be the biggest global conflict in human history. Again. But for the first few months it was more like a not war or a fake war. Basically everyone just sat around not doing much. That's the phony war. That lasted for 8 months. Then comes around 1940 and Germany executed his planned attack on the West. France fell in less than 40 days and about 300,000 Allied soldiers found themselves cornered at the coastal city of Dunkirk. What came next in our timeline was the so-called Dunkirk miracle, the evacuation of most soldiers back to Britain carried out in 9 days and using civilian ships. Look, this event is called the miracle for a reason. It brought 338,000 highly trained, highly valuable British soldiers back to English soil. These guys would be free not only to fight another day, but also to train new armies. And apart from that, after the fall of Britain's main European ally, this triumph at Dunkirk was a much needed boost to popular morality. So what if instead of the Dunkirk miracle, some alteration transformed it into the Dunkirk catastrophe? What if due to bad weather, a slow response, or sheer bad luck, this highly unlikely last-minute effort didn't go as well, leaving Germany with just under 300,000 British prisoners of war? How would this have altered politics back in the mainland? An English peace treaty with Germany was already fairly close to happening in our own timeline. Maybe in this scenario, the return of 1/3 citizens would be enough to push the balance to the other side. A pacified Britain would mean an easier invasion of Greece, an easier invasion of Yugoslavia, no Battle of Britain, which crippled the German Air Force, and an overall stronger German army in general, as well as an overall weaker Allied resistance. The US would lose its main link to the war in Europe, and thanks to having an easier time with the rest of Europe, the Germans might be even able to start Operation Barbarossa early, and maybe even take Stalingrad, Moscow, Leningrad. Now, I don't think this leads to like the conquest of England or the Soviet Union, but it could very well lead to the defeat and pacification of both, effectively putting an end to the European theater of war in an Axis victory. Now, I know what you are thinking, but what about the US? Would they really not care? Well, yeah, pretty much. By the time the peace with Britain inevitably ended, it would be too late for a significant American intervention. And before this happens, they would just lack any motivation to act. That is, of course, except for one very important exception, the 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor. This incident in our own timeline led to America declaring war on Japan, and as a crazy consequence, Germany declaring war on the US. Now, this had many effects on the war in Europe, but in this timeline the main one would come in 1945, when the US would likely make a nuclear strike on Berlin. This was the original goal of the Manhattan Project, and the only reason it didn't actually happen in our own timeline is because Berlin fell before the atomic bombs were ready, leaving the USSR and not the US to give the final blow. But with the Soviets pacified, this is how the war in Europe would likely have ended. Now, the thing is, any timeline that has the US developing nuclear weapons before Germany makes it impossible, in my view, for a long-term Axis victory. And so here is where my second alteration comes. Personally, I think it's far more likely for a more cautious Germany to not declare war on the United States than it is for the Germans to develop nuclear weapons, so I'd go with this first option. In this timeline, Japan would also eventually surrender to the US after being abandoned by its European allies, but this would have no effect on Germany's victory in Europe. The world would then probably be divided into two blocks of influence. A German-led old world encompassing most of Europe, Africa and Asia, characterized for high government spending, authoritarian regimes and institutionalized discrimination, and the democratic, capitalist, low state intervention American English bloc, encompassing most of the New World as well as the British overseas territories. These two blocks would then probably enter a Cold War like the one in our timeline, by competing in many frontiers. Now, for how long this overextended German Reich could last, having such diverse cultures and languages, is anyone's best guess. I personally believe a collapse towards the end of the 20th century would be a likely outcome, maybe even earlier. However, this state, even if short-lived, would have a strong impact on the world's technological development. During the war, Germany was the most advanced and technologically ambitious nation on the planet, and probably an Axis victory would lead to an acceleration in the development of military technology, even faster than in our own timeline. But how these technologies would change the world, how the German space program would look like, and other ideas like how Germany would manage an equivalent of the Cuban Missile Crisis, or how other countries like Communist China, North Korea or Vietnam would look without the Soviets, are all questions that will remain unanswered, as this is all only my personal take of something that maybe could have happened but didn't. Subscribe.